She didn't bring a script. She didn't bring a smile. Caroline Leavitt walked into that studio like a storm in heels, ready, sharp, and unshaken. She thought it would be just another media hit. A few jokes, a few jabs, and she'd leave untouched. But Jimmy Kimmel had other plans. And so did someone in the audience. What started as a playful interview turned into something raw, unscripted, and nationally explosive. Within minutes, the studio audience stopped laughing. The control room stopped breathing. And millions of viewers found themselves watching a moment no one could walk away from. It wasn't just TV anymore. It was a mirror. A clash between two Americas, live and unfiltered. And in the middle of it all, a young woman with no mic, no title, and a voice that cut through the noise like truth with a blade. You think you've seen a meltdown? You haven't seen anything yet. The lights in Studio 6A burned a little brighter that night. The applause sign flickered twice before the warm-up comic gave his final cue, and the crowd, eager, expectant, caffeinated, roared to life. But behind the curtain, the energy wasn't laughter. It was something sharper. The kind of tension that buzzes through a production crew when they know the segment might go off script. Jimmy Kimmel walked to his mark like it was any other night, cards in hand, tie slightly loosened for charm. He'd done this 1,000 times. Roast the guest. Get the laughs. Keep the mood moving. But tonight's guest wasn't just a politician. She was a signal flare in a culture war that never slept. Caroline Leavitt stepped into the studio with a practiced calm. Her heels clicked against the polished floor. She didn't smile at the stage manager. She didn't wave to the crew. She went straight to her seat, adjusted her mic, and waited. The audience didn't boo. They didn't cheer much either. Just a hesitant murmur, as if they, too, weren't sure what was about to happen. Jimmy started the show with his usual wit. Welcome back, folks. Tonight we're joined by a woman who thinks banning books is freedom, Twitter is truth, and Donald Trump is a prophet. A few laughs. A few groans. Caroline crossed her arms, unshaken. Wow, she said with a tight smile. You really are scared of conservative women with a brain. Oh no, Jimmy said, matching her smile. I'm just scared of people who confuse confidence with correctness. It was punchy. It was expected. But then something shifted. As the segment unfolded, the tone darkened. Jimmy leaned in. Caroline stiffened. The audience stopped laughing. The conversation turned from playful jabs to ideological knives. And then, Jimmy brought up the topic everyone in the control room had been waiting for. Let's talk about January 6th, he said, calm but loaded. Was that a protest, or an attempted coup? Caroline's posture snapped upright. It was a protest gone wrong, she said. Unlike BLM riots, nobody burned down a target. Gasps. Audible reactions. A woman in the third row stood up. You don't speak for us, she shouted. Security moved, but Jimmy raised a hand. Let her talk, he said. This is the real America, loud, messy, uncomfortable. And just like that, a comedy show wasn't funny anymore. Caroline sat straighter. Jimmy leaned forward. Neither of them blinked. No one in the audience realized what this had become, not yet. But the producers did. The segment they thought would be 5 minutes of political sparring had turned into something else entirely. A live, unscripted confrontation. The energy shifted in the studio. It wasn't just political anymore, it was personal. Caroline leaned forward, her voice low but edged with steel. You want to talk about January 6th? Fine. Let's talk. It was chaos. And it was wrong. But don't you dare compare it to BLM riots where people burned down cities and got praised for it. The crowd responded like a live wire had been struck. Some clapped. Others gasped. Jimmy's face hardened. You think that's a fair comparison? He asked. I think it's an inconvenient truth, Caroline replied, not breaking eye contact. Jimmy nodded slowly. And yet here you are talking about truth, on a show you claim is nothing but liberal noise. I came here because truth deserves to be heard even in hostile territory, she snapped back. At that moment, it stopped being television. It became a stage with no script, no cue cards, no safety nets. Just two people, standing on opposite ends of America's ideological fault line. A producer whispered in the control room, We're not cutting to commercial. Jimmy set his cards down. Okay, he said more seriously now. Then let's go deeper. The next 10 minutes weren't jokes. They were sharp, uncomfortable, and blisteringly real. They talked about education, immigration, media bias, gender politics. Caroline spoke in bulletproof phrases. Jimmy responded with sarcasm laced in frustration. Then, something unexpected happened. A young woman in the back row stood up without warning. She wasn't planted. She wasn't mic'd. But her voice rang clear. "You say you're not afraid of the truth," she said, shaking slightly. "But everything you say is built on fear. Fear of books. Fear of voices. Fear of people who don't look like you." The room froze. Caroline turned toward her slowly. "And you?" she asked icily. "Are you speaking from facts or from your TikTok feed?" Gasps rippled across the room. Jimmy didn't interfere. He watched. The tension was no longer between guest and host. It was between two Americas, one standing on stage, the other rising from the audience. The woman didn't back down. "I speak for myself. And you don't get to define what patriotism looks like just because you yell louder." Security moved slightly. The floor manager gave a subtle wave. Jimmy shook his head. "Let her speak," he said. "This is what free speech looks like, Caroline. It's not just a slogan. It's uncomfortable. It's unpredictable. And it's very, very real." Caroline laughed bitterly. "You call this dialogue? It's a circus. Your audience cheers for cheap slogans and calls it courage." Jimmy stood up. "No. Courage is coming here knowing you'll be challenged and still sitting in that chair." Their eyes locked again. Caroline's voice dropped. "You think you've trapped me in your world, but I've lived through worse than applause lines and camera lights. You don't scare me, Jimmy. None of this does." "Good," he said. "Because it's not supposed to scare you. It's supposed to make you think." Silence. No music. No applause. Caroline exhaled slowly. For the first time, her composure cracked. Not completely, but just enough for the camera to catch the flicker in her eyes. The young woman in the back sat down. But the message had landed. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about exposure. The cameras didn't cut. Not right away. The studio was silent. Caroline sat still, her fingers slightly curled against the armrest, jaw clenched but trembling ever so slightly. Jimmy Kimmel, still standing, looked less like a talk show host and more like a man who had just realized this wasn't a show anymore. This was something else. The live feed stayed on for a few seconds longer than scheduled. Enough time for viewers at home to see the rawness. No laugh track, no clever edits, no applause. Just tension. Real, unresolved tension. Then the screen faded to black. But America didn't. Within minutes, the clip spread across social media like wildfire. Not just the sound bites, but the silence. That moment where no one had a comeback. No punchline. No commercial break to smooth the edges. It was trending under hashtags like #RawAmerica, #WhenSilenceHits, and #UnscriptedTruth. The confrontation between Caroline and the audience member became the flashpoint of the evening. News panels dissected it. Commentators from both sides took sides. Some called Caroline brave for standing in the lion's den. Others called her reckless, even dangerous. And Jimmy? He remained quiet for hours after the show. When he finally tweeted, it wasn't sarcasm or punchy one-liners. It was one sentence. Sometimes the truth doesn't clap. Caroline's team immediately tried to steer the narrative. A press statement was released by morning, calling the show a staged ambush and painting Caroline as the lone voice of reason amid an ideological mob. But the damage or the shift, depending on who you asked, had already been done. Clips of the young woman who stood up in the audience were now everywhere. No one knew her name, but her words had echoed louder than any headline. "You don't get to define patriotism just because you yell louder." That line became a rallying cry. In classrooms, it sparked debates. In online forums, it was turned into art, remixes, graffiti. In living rooms across the country, people asked themselves, who really won that night? Caroline didn't back down publicly. But privately, sources close to her admitted she had been rattled. Not by Jimmy, not even by the crowd, but by the silence, the absence of her usual cheering section, the crack in the confidence she had always weaponized so well. Jimmy, in contrast, ended the week with a quiet segment, not jokes but reflection. "No matter where you stand politically," he said, "what happened here wasn't entertainment. It was a mirror. And we all saw something." He paused. Maybe the job isn't to win the argument. Maybe it's to listen to what's never said. And that was it. No dramatic takedown. No viral insult. Just the strange, heavy realization that something had changed, on stage, off stage, and inside the millions who watched. Weeks later, the young woman from the audience came forward. Her name was Talia Grant, a 24-year-old community organizer from Oakland. She wasn't famous. She didn't want to be. But when asked why she stood up, she said, because I've seen too many people sit down when they were supposed to say something." That quote was printed across posters, quoted in op-eds, turned into t-shirts. Caroline kept appearing on networks that aligned with her views, but she was never quite the same. The fire was still there, but something behind it had shifted. As for Jimmy, he went back to jokes and celebrity interviews. But sometimes when the crowd laughed too hard, he'd pause, look past the lights, as if still remembering the night when no one laughed, when the script didn't matter. And for the people who watched that night, it wasn't about taking sides anymore. It was about recognizing that sometimes the loudest sound in the room is silence.